The first weird occurrence started at 6:00 a.m. on a Wednesday. Local resident Brandon Johnson woke up after hearing screams coming from his backyard. He lived in a quiet part of town where residents respected each other's rest, so this was odd, to say the least. But what Brandon found made him turn pale instantly. According to Brandon, the scream that woke him up wasn't extremely loud, but it was high-pitched, cutting right through his sleep like a knife through butter. The confused homeowner lay beside his bed and looked around, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the sound. "It's the backyard," Brandon said to himself anxiously. His neighborhood watch was thorough, and almost no person who did not belong in their suburbs slipped through the cracks. So, who was now screaming so close to his house? Brandon opened the curtains and peeked through his bedroom window to find out. But when he looked, the patio behind his home appeared empty. At least, that was what Brandon thought. Because pretty soon he would get the surprise of a lifetime. Brandon grabbed a bathrobe and slowly and quietly ventured downstairs. Whatever was screaming so close to his house might get scared and run away if Brandon arrived with too much noise himself. The screaming had died down, but the tension was still palpable as Brandon opened the back door of his house. He had a broom in hand, with the stick part pointing upward for protection. Somebody was still lurking around his property. He could just feel it. Brandon swung his stick around several times, and then there were no screams as a response. But the sweeping wind sound that came from his broomstick set in motion something just as frightening. A fumbling sound came from just outside his garden fence, as if somebody had fallen over a set of trash cans or something. Brandon's footsteps moved forward quickly. Behind the property was the place where residents kept their dumpsters, so the sound emanating from behind Brandon's fence made sense. The confused homeowner swung open the wooden door and looked out onto the concrete inner court where the dumpsters were. And that is when things took a turn in a hurry. It was quiet once more, making it seem like Brandon had moved a bit too slowly. "Damn, did I miss it?" Brandon spoke to himself, but it would turn out that he would not return home empty-handed though. Brandon looked around and navigated the area that kept the neighborhood trash. Some smaller trash cans had fallen over, so Brandon's guess that someone had gotten scared and knocked them over seemed legitimate. With confidence that who or whatever was there was gone, Brandon continued his search. But when he reached his own dumpster, a shiver instantly shot down his spine. What the hell? Brandon and his direct neighbors shared a sizable green dumpster that held enough trash to last them a month before pickup came by. But somehow, they always filled it up within a week. And now Brandon finally saw why. There was a door in it that Brandon had never seen before. The dumpster always stood against a brick wall, which covered its backside, and with it, this apparent door. But now that it had moved, Brandon could clearly see a passageway. And it turned out to be open, even. Brandon frowned his eyebrows and slowly walked up to the strange metal doorway. What is this? With the door open, Brandon saw a large secret compartment in there. It was separate from the part where residents threw in the trash. It had a wooden paneled floor, light fixtures, and even a coffee maker. The place had all the luxuries of a tiny one-bedroom apartment cramped in the size of a dumpster. Someone was living inside Brandon's trash container, and the thought of that was highly concerning. Brandon was starting to feel unsafe in his own neighborhood, and he did not like that feeling at all. The frightened man stepped out of the metal container and did the only thing he could think of. If his neighborhood watch slipped up and let this intruder slip through the cracks, it was time for the police to take over. Without hesitation, Brandon pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "Hello, is this the police? I want to report a crime that has been committed on my property." The police started out by listening politely to Brandon's complaint, and Brandon felt hurt at first. But at the end of his complaint, it quickly became clear that the police were not eager to get involved. They stated that the ground behind Brandon's home was public property, so he had no claiming rights. Also, the police were very busy with actual crimes, so they could not send officers over for such a minor dispute. It also didn't help that Brandon had not yet locked eyes with the trespasser. "We don't even know who to look for, sir." Brandon couldn't argue with that and hung up the phone, disappointed. He understood the police's reasoning, but it didn't make him less afraid and nervous. Someone was living here, and if the police weren't going to help, He needed to confront this person himself. He didn't have to wait long, though, for this confrontation because just moments later, the following happened. Brandon closed the dumpster door and went back to his house to form a plan when he suddenly felt watched. As a logical response, Brandon turned around instantly, scanning the perimeter to spot any signs of movement. "I know you're still here. Come out and face me, you coward," Brandon shouted. But as expected, there was no response. The broomstick pitted against his garden fence was repositioned in Brandon's hand, and with it, he started walking past the borders of the lot. Brandon tapped the metal fence that shielded the lot from the public road, and when Brandon got to the corner and tapped there, he heard the sound of feet moving. "Got you, you bastard," Brandon said with a careful smirk on his face. The irritated Brandon rushed over to the opening in the fence and made it to the public road as quickly as he could. And there she was. Brandon saw a small female, around 5'2" in height. She looked him straight in the eyes before bolting off around the corner. Everyone in the neighborhood was still asleep, but Brandon was wide awake with proof that somebody who wasn't supposed to be was definitely out there. Brandon could not let her get away, so he took it upon himself to initiate pursuit without hesitation. Brandon only wore the flip-flop he slipped into when he left his bed, but with them, he hurled down the sidewalk at high speed. Within seconds, he himself reached the corner, but to his great regret, the woman who watched him had already disappeared when he arrived. Brandon shouted loudly out of sheer irritation, waking some of the neighborhood residents in the process. It was still early, so they were in their rights to be angry, and Brandon apologized accordingly, but the fact remained that he lost his suspect. Brandon walked back to the dumpster, defeated. There was only one thing left to do: remove the living room setup and lock his dumpster with a padded lock so the squatter could not get in anymore. But something would prevent Brandon from finishing that task. Brandon reached the mysterious dumpster home and was ready to put an end to this horrid night. He had some tools in his shed and was ready to clear out whatever was in there, but only after taking a final look at the interior. I mean, what harm could one final glance do, right? Brandon stepped into the container, not expecting to find anything shocking. It was someone's tiny home, which had already been made clear when he first looked inside. But there was much more to this hidden home than met the eye. Brandon was tall and needed to duck while searching through the dumpster's innards. He saw a tiny couch, a pull-out model that could be turned into a bed at night. In addition to the rest of the basic necessities, he also saw a few picture frames. Brandon picked up one of them and held it close to the door opening so the outside streetlight could illuminate the photo. There was a middle-aged woman with long blonde hair on it and a young girl who stood beside her. Brandon's eyes squinted, and something inside of him told him that this person looked familiar, but who was she? He presumed that the person in the picture was the woman owning the dumpster home, but based on the individual he had just chased through the neighborhood, he could not say they looked alike. The small, dirty-looking individual he chased looked much older and had more salt and pepper-colored hair. But Brandon was not granted much time to calmly think about the comparison because then the following thing happened. The moment he lowered the picture frame and looked outside the dumpster, he got a major fright. The woman he had chased down the streets had returned, and this time, she looked angry. She held the door to the container in her hand, and with it, she would turn the table on her hunter. Brandon knew what she was about to do, and pleaded with her to stop her next action. But it was already too late for him. The woman grunted deeply one time and then proceeded to slam the dumpster door shut, locking Brandon inside. It was now pitch black all around Brandon. As he shouted for the woman to let him out, Brandon repeatedly fell over pieces of makeshift furniture. "Please, lady, I meant you no harm. You must understand that finding out someone is living inside your dumpster causes an initial sense of panic. I just wanted answers as to why." Brandon used all the pleading words he could think of, but the woman who locked him inside was stubborn and ignored every last one. She was in control now. After a while, Brandon simply gave up. He used his time well, though. With a flashlight on his phone, he went through the closed box. He knew she was still outside, probably with her back against the door, but Brandon chose not to engage. He went through drawers and searched underneath the couch to find out who she was, and that's when he found it. And then, inside a makeshift nightstand next to her couch, there was a book. Well, it was not just any book. The doodling on the front and the handwritten words inside revealed to Brandon that this was the woman's personal journal. This diary of sorts was very well organized. It had dates written on top of every page, and one name kept repeating itself: Linda. That name sounded so familiar to Brandon, but where did he hear it before? And that's when a spark suddenly ignited in Brandon's brain. His eyes grew twice in size, and his skin turned almost pale instantly, even though it was hard to see in the darkness of the container. He closed the book because he no longer needed it to identify this woman. The long blonde hair and friendly smile he witnessed in the picture now painted an image clear as day. It even portrayed a picture explaining the salt and pepper-haired woman outside the container, since they were one and the same. Brandon inched forward to the dumpster door. He scraped his throat a few times and then placed his hand on the container's exit. "Hello, miss. I think I know who you are. And if my guesses are right, then I am so sorry that this happened to you. I could have stopped it." There was a short moment of silence after Brandon made that statement. But then, slowly but surely, the dumpster door opened up. The streetlight's glare shone inside, blinding Brandon for a moment. But when his eyes eventually adjusted, he looked at the face of a crying woman. "Do you recognize me now?" she said. Brandon nodded his head and apologized once more. "You are Linda Andrews, right?" The woman's eyes teared up again as she confirmed Brandon's hypothesis. With this confirmation, Brandon took over the conversation without any hostility from either party because there was a form of understanding between the two of them. Linda Andrews wasn't someone he knew on a personal level, but everyone knew her name within the suburban neighborhood in which Brandon lived. She was a single mother who had lived in their neighborhood up until about a year ago. She divorced her husband after a tough marriage, and then her life quickly spiraled. She struggled to pay rent. And even though she held 3 jobs to pay for a life that provided primary care for her and her daughter, bad hands were still dealt to her. Those badly dealt cards eventually ended up in a horrible conclusion, leading to her downfall. Linda's struggles were going on well before her downfall, but Brandon only learned of them at that final point. He was called to a neighborhood meeting to discuss her situation. Everyone was there, and the meeting started out with accusations. It was her next-door neighbor who spoke negatively of her. He stated that her garden was bewildering and her house looked unkempt. According to him, it badly influenced how people perceived their perfectly structured and clean neighborhood. And he requested that she leave her home and the neighborhood in its entirety. Brandon immediately found this request preposterous and didn't agree at all. After Linda explained the harsh situation, he felt even more on her side. Brandon even advocated for her for a short while during the meeting. Her having 3 jobs and being exhausted by the end of the day was just too much to perfectly meet the unrealistic neighbor's standards of maintaining a house's exterior. But in the end, the community won, and Linda was removed from her home simply because of the public perspective. After being kicked out, I was placed on a bad tenant list and could not get another rental house. I ended up on the streets, even having to send my daughter to live with family. I found it impossible to live on the streets in the city center. People and surroundings were rough there, and homeless shelters were not as nice as you might think. I then lost my job because of bad self-care and hygiene, which was impossible to maintain as a homeless woman. Ultimately, I returned to the place I hated the most, this neighborhood. I have lived here for over 6 months now. Linda explained she knew the containers had a weird secondary compartment and figured she could live secretly there. She chose Brandon's container purposely because he was the only one who stood up for her. "So now you know," Linda said. And then Brandon did something amazing. He hugged Linda intently, offered to help, and gave her the guest room in his house, which was too large for himself anyway. Because of this, she regained her self-worth and quickly found a new job and a purpose in life. This turned things around. The rejuvenated woman looked years younger in a matter of weeks and eventually found a new job. With Brandon's help, she even landed a small apartment. Her daughter could return, and Linda looked forward to the future. See how a bit of understanding could make a massive difference in someone's life.